Plato, Governance, Forms, and Caves. To get started, we have our outline as is normal, but there is something we need to notice about it is that we will go through like these core questions. We'll go through this background information. We'll definitely go through Plato's criticisms of radical Athenian democracy. We'll go through Plato's alternative proposal. He criticizes something, then he provides a potential solution. When we get to 5, unfortunately, the time just was not with me this previous week, and I was not able to fully write out this and develop this. It's okay. The class is being built on the fly. We have plenty to talk about this week and to be able to do discussion, do assignments, no problem. But my apologies. In a future semester, this number 5 will be way more fully developed, but we have enough to do well this week without it. And then number 6, we do work with this week, but it's not completely finished out either of what it will be in a future semester. But either way, just to give people a heads up, it sometimes that happens when you're building things in real time. To get started, the core question. The core questions that in this handout, we'll go through and obtain answers to these questions, like what was Athens' radical democracy? Why didn't Plato like it? What were his specific criticisms of it? What alternative did he propose? How did he defend his proposal? In terms of metaphysics and epistemology, this is a question we won't go into this week. And finally, might we be right now existing in various caves regarding types of governance? We will actually have a chance to work with that during this week's discussion. And then perhaps regarding other things as well. That's a reference back to this notion of being in these various caves. So that's the way things are structured throughout this handout. It's a little different than we've done in the previous weeks, but Plato lends himself to having a slightly different approach. It's totally fine. It's still the way philosophy works. You end up with questions, you seek answers to those questions, and then you seek reasons in support of those answers. You deal with objections, replies. It's the same philosophic pattern. So to get started, we just start where we are. Sometimes that's the best place to begin is where are you? Well, that's where you have to start from. So most people in this class, not all potentially, but most will be living in a country that falls within the idea of the Western world, which is like the United States, the UK, France, Canada, even Australia, and even Japan to a certain extent. If you want to think in terms of the Western world being something like NATO and the range of NATO, but either way, it's many of the countries in the Western world, you'll often hear the notion that they are democracies. They're Western democracies. Well, it's totally common for us living in these various countries to hear things like, we are a democracy. We're a democratic nation. Our system of government is government by the people and for the people. Democracy is the best type of governance. That may not always be said, but it's often implied in what we encounter in the Western world. We must protect our democracy. Someone or something is threatening our democracy. Each of these claims is overtly and covertly, it implies that democracy is a very good thing. Even the one that something's threatening it implies that it's a good thing, it should be protected. But what is it? Well, it's a form of governance that grants, in the ideal, maybe not in the real world, but in the ideal world, the ideal of democracy, just in general, any type that it comes in, is that it grants and ensures that the people, the demos, that D-E-M-O, and you put an S after demos, The people have a meaningful say in and core controls over the ways that they are governed. That is, in the types of laws that are proposed and eventually passed, the people have some say in that. It could be like in the case of the United States, we have what's known as a representative democracy. We actually have a republic, is what we have. And then democracy is just the mechanism by which we select our representatives to go in and supposedly represent our views. So democracy is just a mechanism of leadership selection, but it's not. It doesn't always have to take that form. There are other kinds of democracy, as we'll see today, but they all have this notion that some sense of the people have some meaningful say and core controls over the ways that they're governed, the types of laws that are proposed, passed, the selection of specific individuals that'll lead the nation, that'll have, and they have some control over the social, the cultural, the economic, political, spiritual goals and ideals that a nation works to achieve. And so in a democracy, government decisions and the ultimate power and control over the nation is supposed to reside firmly in the hands of the people, in the hands of the demos. And with all the major decision making, say, and control in the hands of the people, by default, democracy tends to result in the greatest number of people being maximally free. Or this is at least the selling point of democracy type of governance, is that the assumption is, or it's often just implied, is that you'll have more freedom in a democracy than maybe you would have in a monarchy. So if you had a king, a queen, some royal family, and then you can have hybrids of governance where you have a monarchy, say in England, but then you still have this sort of voting mechanism built in parliaments and all. So you can have hybrids of governance, but you could also have tyrannies or dictatorships or totalitarian regimes, or you could have oligarchies ruled by the few. So democracy is not the only game in town. But so it's kind of like if you think you go to the store, well, how does somebody sell you their products? Say you're on the cereal aisle and there's all these cereal boxes. Well, every manufacturer of cereal is trying to put a cover on it that maybe attracts your eye to get you to purchase that. Well, if you're thinking of democracies, one cereal box on an aisle of governance options, then what it's supposed to do, or how it's often branded, is that that democracy tends to result in the greatest number of people in a nation being maximally free to pursue their own interest in what makes them happy. I mean, this is a kind of Americanized U.S. style way of thinking about things, but it's still basically true. It's what sells people on democracy, is this idea that it's supposed to result in the greatest number of people being free to pursue their own interest. And the reasoning or the assumption behind that is that the assumption is that if you have a bunch of people in a society, a majority of people in a society that have a say and control over how their government works, that you would expect that they're not going to create a bunch of laws that lock themselves down and take away a lot of their ability to do things. That may not be a good assumption. People can vote themselves into a lot of problems and a lot of constraints. It happens. In any democracy, it happens too. But the idea is you're supposedly the people are going to look after their own interest. And one interest that most people have is to be free, or at least think they're free to some extent. And so democracy is supposed to deliver on that as a type of leadership selection, but even more important, the fact that the people themselves are supposed to be in control of these things, not a singular king or a queen or things like that. And so one can count on democracies to always have lots of freedoms, or at least lots more than any other type of governance. That's the selling. That would be the cover of the cereal box on the aisle of cereal boxes with the government types you could pick from. And thus, democracy is supposed to be perhaps the only. If you're in a democracy-style nation, you're going to hear things like this quite frequently. that it's supposed to be perhaps the only form of governance that's inherently tilted toward maximizing and protecting the freedoms of the people, the only form that's perhaps worth fighting for and, if necessary, dying for. The reason normally I don't read through an entire paragraph, but that's important to kind of have those thoughts in mind as we, move toward Plato. Because Plato was inside one of the very first democracies in Athens. And I mean, Athens had been of this sort of democracy style selection of leaders method, but it also had these ideals of freedoms and people having control over what happens in their lives by controlling what the government's up to through they have a say in the laws that are passed, the decisions like do we go to war or not, all those kind of things. The demos, the people had some say in it in Athens, and Plato grew up in it, and then Plato was very critical of it. And so it's important to kind of set a baseline of the supposed selling points of democracy, and even in the contemporary world. So that's why, after encountering these notions that many of us will have heard our whole lives about the pros and the selling points of democracy, it may be like real difficult to even imagine that a reasonable or a smart or a decent and intelligent human being would deny any of these things. Like that people having a hand and a say in their government is a good thing. It'd be, it's almost unimaginable to think someone could think that way if one's been raised and grew up inside democracy. That, and there's some sarcasm here, it's like one of the most obviously horrific sort of cultural and social errors is to try to argue against democracy itself, to say, hey, there may be alternatives that's better than this. That this is not the only box of governance cereal on the aisle. Well, Plato does exactly that. He proposes an alternative. He criticizes an Athenian form of democracy that's not quite the same as what we have today, but it shares, it's a democracy. It shares many of the same characteristics. So, Plato, he was no fan of Athens' specific type of radical democracy. But he did grant that democracy-style types of governance, that they do have perks and that they can be extraordinarily worthwhile. Like, for example, and this is a big deal to think about, is that Plato granted that democracies tend to be freer environments for people to live in. A nation that has democracy as its form of governance does tend to have more freedoms. There is some truth to that assumption that if the people do have a direct say and direct sense of control over their laws that are passed over them, then they're not so quick to pass a bunch of laws that limit their freedoms terribly bad. They could. That's the thing. You could vote yourself into a tyranny while you're in a democracy. But it's very hard to vote your way out once you do. It may be impossible. The line is sometimes in a democracy, you can vote yourself into something that you have to fight your way out of. That's sometimes said. And so, but Plato admitted that there tends to be a much freer environment, and that freer environment was perhaps absolutely necessary for something like philosophy itself to have ever emerged. That you think about it, well, why did like Western philosophy, what we've been talking about thus far and what we will continue to the whole semester, might it have been the case that you would have never been able to have, like, say, any alternative to, say, the Greek spiritual worldview? You would have never had things like the sophists or the pre-Socratics if a certain type of governance wasn't already in play that allowed people the mental freedom to actually go out and assemble in groups, where, small groups or whatever, and talk about things and talk about alternatives, to actually even be free enough to raise a question, like, well, we know that Homer and Hesiod, they're just channeling the muses, and that even the muses, we know sometimes, they make up things. They give us better stories than actually reality was, for motivational purposes or whatever reasons. And it's like, so what if the majority of the things that Homer and Hesiod, the famous, Greek poets, and then you have the playwrights, Euripides and all those, what if most of that's not actually true? And so to be, is it necessary to have a particular type of governance and it's in a amount of latitude and freedom to ever even question your sort of traditional spiritual religious style belief system? Plato thought maybe, so, and that would be a perk because that opens the door to the very possibility of doing philosophy, because it asks a lot of questions and looks at a lot of answers and tries to defend or deny various answers. And you have to have an area that you can actually speak and think freely, to a certain extent with others, to be able to ever develop something like philosophy itself as it exists today. And so Plato granted that the entire project that he and Socrates, and I mean, Plato built a school, the academy to teach people how to do philosophy stuff and how to think like a philosophy person. And it's like even he will readily admit that may could have only happened in somewhere like Athens. But at the same time, he thinks democracy is terribly flawed in the form that Athens had. And so what Plato wants, or what he ultimately does, is he argues that these core assumptions, this leaders selection mechanism, voting and elections that democracy is associated with, it leaves much to be desired. That if one truly wants to establish a good state, a moral state, a virtuous state, a state that treats the most decent and the best of the citizens the best, then one needs to develop some kind of alternative to democracy. Like you can't get, according to Plato, this is one of his big core claims, is that you cannot establish what he conceptualizes as a truly good state if you have democracy as your main type of governance. Those two things are incompatible in Plato's mind. And that applies, Plato would apply that to just any type of democracy. I mean, he was familiar with Athens' type of democracy at his time, but Athens' democracy developed over time, so he knew what it was, and as it changed and it morphed in time, because that's the nature of democracy too, is that if people are voting and deciding on leaders, they don't just have an appointed king or a pharaoh or whatever that starts it when they're in the youth and then they live to be 70, 80 years old. I mean, that's multiple generations of youth where it's just basically the same. Yeah, this is the pharaoh and this is the way it works. Whereas democracy can be much more dynamic because the leaders are changing. And then the people of some sort, the notion of the people and who counts as a people is actually matters to this day. We have current Supreme Court cases that argue about who actually counts as the people versus who doesn't. So that changes in time. But either way, the people, whoever they are, is they have a say and direct control in what's going on in the government. And invariably, people change their minds, and then the government, the policies and the laws change in democracies. It's not nearly as stable and predictable a type of government as alternatives may be, and Plato would say that with certainty. He would claim it. There's absolutely certain that he did claim it, that democracies are not nearly as stable as other forms of governance might be. So to go forward, what is the background though? Okay, so what is the background of Plato? Well, the first 30 years of Plato's life occurred in tremendously unstable times. I mean, like some people say, we're living in unstable times, and there's likely some truth to that. Well, Plato lived in times that are perhaps even more unstable. That he was born a few years after, I mean, just think about this, that he's born a few years after what, even in its own time, people considered to be the age of Pericles, or this golden age of Athens. And there's the dates, it's 30 years. And it's helpful to understand that, to know a little bit about that golden age. Like Pericles, he was an Athenian general, he's a statesman, that he fought in some of the wars between the Greek city states and the Persian Empire. Um, and the idea is that it was that there was actually a revolt against the Persian rule, and the some Greek city states decided to revolt against the Persians, and then that kicked off the Persians, reasserting their authority. They were a big empire at the time, and one of your colonies, essentially, is the way you could think about the place. Is it was some Greek city states that were essentially the Persians had claimed as their own. They had their own administrators there, their own, enforcers of whatever they wanted to be done there. And then the Greeks pushed back. And then what happens when colonies try to break away from the hub or the superpower is the superpower comes in and tries to reestablish control and dominance. Happens today, happened 2,500, 2,600 years ago. It's just the way things work. But interestingly enough, is that the Greek city states eventually they won this. They pushed the Persians back. And that was during the Greco-Persian War. Well, then Pericles was in this first Peloponnesian War as well, and this was between, like we discussed previously, between the Athenians and the Spartans, the two big superpowers that emerged after and during this Greco-Persian War. And Pericles actually, he had success in both of those cases. So there's these two big wars, for a time running simultaneously. And he had quite success. And then he did a 30 years peace, but it didn't last 30 years between Athens and Sparta. Treaties don't necessarily last. There's been dozens, if not hundreds, of perpetual peace treaties. We're friends forever, but then no, forever is a lot shorter than forever it tends to be. And then eventually Pericles died of the plague because of all these wars. Plague invariably shows up, disease, things like that. And that swamped through Athens, multiple times. Well, why though would this be a golden age? That you'd say, why? How could this be the good times? You got two wars running. You've got plagues. How is this the golden age? Well, because that's when many of the big architectural and sculptural projects that we associate, and you can still go to Athens to this day and see some of these things, like not Athena, not the Zeus statues, even though these were two of supposedly some of the most impressive statues around in the Western style world. But you can still see the Parthenon and parts of the Acropolis. And also, this is your age of your big Greek playwrights, like Sophocles, Euripides, etc., when they're writing and performing their plays. I mean, this is like high-tier Greek culture as Greek, culture. And that's happening. And but one of the most significant things, also why it's known as a golden age, is that it creates, for our purposes, this form of democracy. That grows up in this time, and eventually with Pericles, it becomes a sort of radical democracy. Sometimes like is mentioned, people talk about something's radical when it may not be, but we'll decide for ourselves throughout this video. People can think about that. But either way, Pericles made changes to the democracy that already existed in Athens, and it changed things up. So what was Athens', radical democracy? What are its key characteristics? Well, before you do that and get there, you need to know that what was its style democracy? Well, like I've said, sometimes it's even claimed that Athens invented democracy. That may or may not be true. It depends. The Greeks did a lot of trading. Their economies and stuff's built on interacting with people from all over around the Mediterranean Sea, as well as there's land. People can walk, travelers. There could have been others, say, in the area, not necessarily a Persian Empire, but maybe beyond. That ideas could have came about, but either way, it's a sort of common idea that you will encounter that Athens supposedly invented democracy. Well, from a perspective of today, if when most of the Western world government type of governance and leadership selection is democracy, well, then it makes sense that you'd say, oh yeah, well, Athens, if it invented it, then the time it invented it would be a golden age. But even at the time, the Greeks considered it, their one of their high point eras. And so you got to keep in mind this is unique at the time, that a lot of other forms of governance that were around at the time, instead of a government by the people for the people, remember the people though doesn't necessarily have to be everybody in the population, and it wasn't in Athens by any stretch of the imagination. But the normal alternatives would have been other types of governance would have been like you have kings for life, like god kings or queens for life. And then you have oligarchies, which can be composed of a lot of different things, but it's typically ruled by the few, and it's a select few. Sometimes it could be supposedly the best, the brightest, the smartest, or it could just be the wealthiest, those most ambitious, or it could be either way. It's normally associated with some elite small group that's ruling. It's a group smaller than the mass of the population number, and they're ruling everybody else. Those were your options. So rule by one king and administrators, or rule by a few, maybe equally power administrators, or Athens comes along and it's ruled by a selection of the actual people. Little different. But some of the key characteristics is that the Athenian style democracy before Pericles, that first of all, it was direct democracy. That all the voters were there. It's not like what we have today as a representative democracy, where we elect like representatives for the House in the United States. And then, there's a certain number of those, 435, something like that. And so there's a certain number of representatives that come from each state. We elect those people, and then they go up there, and they're supposed to, ideally, just represent our views. It's like we're speaking through this one person, and we may be 100,000 people in a congressional district. And now, whether that works out that way or not, one can decide for themselves. But that's the ideal. But it's like we, the individuals, don't go to Washington, D.C. and then have the ability to write or click on the thing to vote for the law ourselves. No, there will be an individual selected, to vote for a big mass of us. Well, in Athens, you didn't have that indirectedness where you have the people that elect stand-ins to go vote on their behalf. No, in Athens, it was the people that could vote that were voting, and and they were there. And so the idea, and I mean, it's directly voting on those laws. And you have features of this, with constitutional amendments in certain states to this day in the United States. And they do referendums and stuff in certain Western countries and in non-Western countries too at times. But this idea is in Athens that who was the people? Well, starting out is the 20 years or older Athenian male citizens. And what's interesting is not only was it not all 20 and above male citizens, but, it was typically those who could afford to participate. So the wealthier, or the children of the wealthier, or people that could be sponsored by some wealthier person. Those 20 and older Athenian male citizens, as well as it was mandatory. Like if you were a part of the group that could vote, you had to vote. So, that's different than even today. Like people here could register to vote and vote, but they're not essentially forced to. The government itself is not coming to your door and arresting you if you choose not to vote. Now, but in some Western world countries today, there is a mandatoriness that everybody that can vote has to vote, supposedly. Well, so these ideas, they still are around, but in Athens, it was just the core system was that 20 years or older Athenian male citizens, not all of them, that they were there. They voted directly out of their mouth to the law being passed or not. And then it was mandatory that if they could be there, they had to be there. You know, if you were one of the privileged of these 20-year-old males that could vote, then you had to be there to vote. And there's other features to this that you can read through this. I'm not going to go through it all, but there was other features, you know, that they could vote to exile somebody that seemed like they may be amassing power that could turn into a dictator or tyrant. That was the way a lot of these societies back then functioned, is that you could just vote to remove somebody or kick them out of the city-state. They could go to another city-state. And in ancient classical Greece, they had 1,000 plus to choose from sometimes. And so, but it was still, you lost the ability to even be in the city-state. They take you to the gates and say, go out, and if you come back, you know, you'll be imprisoned or you know, killed or something. And so you're banned from being there. They did this all the way in the Renaissance of this notion of exile. And it still, in some sense, it happens, you know, rarely, but it still happens even to this day, but maybe not for the same reasons as it happened in the past. And so the people who could vote, they voted, they met in assemblies, and they did their voting for laws, economic sanctions on the country, going to war, things like that. Well, given that Pericles was quite successful as a military leader, and that he was eventually voted like as first among equals, this leader of Athens, on the, you know, like a presidential position, or you know, someone that others may defer to his leadership skills, things like that, that he had the power to radicalize Athenian democracy. Well, what did he do? That's what's interesting. What was so radical about Athenian democracy? Well, he just changed one of his core. He did multiple reforms, but one of the ones that's, in some sense, the one that irritated someone like Plato the most, or he thinks caused a lot of problems, is that Pericles opened the door where he took and would take government money. If someone, say a 20-plus-year-old Athenian male that would normally not have qualified, didn't have the money to serve in a government job, you know, somebody that had to work in their shop every day in order just to make enough money to survive, to feed their family, then so they would not be able to be a part of the voting body because they couldn't leave work to do the mandatory attendance to be there to vote. I mean, they could not survive, nor could their family. So what Pericles did is he said, well, yeah, okay, we're going to bring more of these common people. You know, in common is in the sense of these are not the people that could have otherwise afforded to go and be there in the assemblies to vote on things because they had to make a living doing something else every day. And so he says, well, we'll open the gates to more of these people to increase the voter pool by giving them, you know, essentially financial incentives, like say, hey, you can indeed come and serve in the assembly because you get paid to do this other government job. Then that will offset while you're here and not running your business, you still have an income. So you can actually afford to be here mandatory and do what you got to do as a voter. And so the voter pool expanded to include voters from the much larger Athenian male population than the much smaller, wealthier few that had previously been. And so that, as you can imagine, that was not the most welcome thing to some of the more wealthy, you know, old money voter kind of people. But Pericles had the kind of mandate that he could do that and get away with it. And it did have significant impacts. Some would say positive, some would say negative impacts on the way Athenian democracy. But the key to it being radical is that he opened the voter pool. The people got bigger than it was previously. He expanded the pool of voters. That's what he did. And through government incentives, he gave them the financial ability. These people that could not have otherwise been there to vote, he gave them the ability to be there to vote. And then another thing is that something that's different about Athenian democracy, and this is key to understanding where Plato's criticisms come from, is that in Athenian democracy, given that it's direct democracy, everybody's having to debate and vote. I mean, not everybody has to debate and speak, but everybody has to verbally cast their vote. And you're standing there looking at all the other voters, and everybody knows how you voted. I mean, there could have been times when they secret voted stuff, but normally that's not the case. So imagine that everybody that's going to make a decision about this law or whether to go to war, they're all looking at each other in the eye, and that people, of course, just like in today's world, people would be leaning on others to vote in certain ways and to see, did you vote the way, we agreed you would vote? Things like that, of course, were happening too. But one of the keys to it is that it created, just like the lawfare that we previously described in Athens, it created a situation where there was a need and a demand for good public speaking skills, or if not good, persuasive. And well, who did that? The sophists. They were always ready. We'll good public speaking for hired people here. We'll train you how to woo the masses of the other voting people that are standing there. How to do these fantastical rhetorical speeches that get people's mind and you sway the minds of the voter. Well, the thing is maybe that is not such an impactful thing if you're in a group or an assembly with all these other people that can afford to receive the same training. So they see it, if you're trying to pull a con with your words on people, if all these other people have been trained in the art of conning with words, then they're not going to fall for it. They're not going to be as susceptible to essentially the marketing hype that you're building into your words as you're trying to say, yeah, we need to do this law. And, and it's the only way to protect things. It's the only way to protect our democracy, whatever. Well, the thing is that if other people have been trained the same way, which they would have been when it was the more wealthy 20-plus-year-old male Athenian citizens, but that changes when you get your voter pool expands. It's been radicalized by Pericles. And then you have a lot of more common people that even if they're getting paid by the government to be able to be there, they don't have excess money to be trained in sophism, in like the art of manipulating by words or creating, real good orator skills. They probably don't have enough left over to do that. So when they're confronted and they're in this voting assembly by these people that do have this training, well, they're highly susceptible to the manipulation. And moreover, there's also a deferential position, even though maybe they now have the ability to vote and they have to be there to vote and their vote counts as one and no more than one like everybody else. They still are enamored or intimidated by these big, powerful oratory speeches that sound real good, that sound real smart, way more refined and well articulated than they themselves could do. So just like in today's time, good public speaking can carry a person way further than maybe they need to be or should be, or it can get them right where they need to be. It's an extremely valuable skill. And it was able to woo the masses of the common that the voter pool had been expanded to include. And then so you had this sophist and then remember, with the sophist, it's not about the truth with a capital T. It's just about you say what you have to do with reasons to achieve your goal and win the argument or get the law passed that's normally to your own self-interest or your advantage. And so essentially, Plato was born after this age. This is the thing. Think about any of the good that come from this age, but also any of the not so good. Plato's rolling in right after this, so he's going to see if there's bad consequences for any of these changes Pericles made or what the sophists have been up to. Plato's going to roll right into those consequences with his life. But he was born after. And also, people would have been, this age of Pericles was so awesome. Well, then Plato's born after that age. So what does that imply? Well, you're born in the age after the good times. Now we're in the not as good times. And so, but this form of radical democracy was in play, and that Plato was born a year after a year or so. These dates have an approximate quality to them, but about a year after Pericles died. He was 4 when the Second Peloponnesian War broke out. That's the one we've previously encountered between the Athenians and the Spartans that the Athenians ultimately lost. So the war, it didn't go as well for the Athens as the first time around. He was around 23 when the Athens lost to Sparta, and then the 30 tyrants came in. Remember that from previous weeks. And that 2 of those were Plato's relatives, like cousins, uncles. I mean, so the Plato's families connected up with these 30 tyrants, just like Socrates, had friends and stuff, very likely, that were among them. Well, so that's damaging when some of his family have been killed, exiled, whatever, as a result of being a part of the 30 or a part of the list of good 3,000. So that's tough on a family. Well, then that's going on. And then on top of it all, Athens, they kicked back after the 30 tyrants. They pushed the Spartan control out a little bit. And then they have this window of when Athenian democracy style stuff is trying to go back to work. I mean, ultimately, Spartans came in and stopped that again. But in that opening, after the 30 tyrants and before the Spartans came back to take control, you have the death of Socrates, which is Plato's very close mentor and friend. And he never forgave Athens because he blamed Athens for the death of Socrates. And we'll see that. So, what is his very first criticism to move into what is wrong with radical Athenian democracy according to Plato? Well, his very first criticism is he believed that it was responsible for Socrates' death. They killed my friend. They killed my mentor. That's the way Plato would look at it. And that Plato was committed to this idea that you cannot have a good state, a good city-state, or a good nation, a good society, if it's killing off the best of them. And Plato was committed to this idea that whether accurate or inaccurate, he believed that Socrates was one of the best Athenians. And so if Athens, with its legal system, its form of democracy type government, if it can result in the death of one or more of the best of its citizens, then it cannot be the way to get to a good state. And so, well, why would that have been? How did Athens and the radical democracy kill Socrates? Well, remember that you have the sophists and you have all this training and you have all this lawfare going on, and that's allowed and it's an accepted way of life. And so that enabled people that Socrates would embarrass, expose that they're supposedly experts. Then he shows that maybe they're not. And it allows those people to engage in lawfare against Socrates. It also allows with that them to speak, fancy orator skills and get laws passed that then later they get used against Socrates. But it's that sophism that's built into it that's allowed to flourish and allowed to run rampant throughout the voting and the legal system that is a direct result to Plato. That is part of what a democracy is that it has this freedom for people to be trained to try to sway people. And maybe you have people that are not trained themselves in it, like the more common voters that Pericles had let in. And then they can be swayed to make decisions that are not in the interest of the city itself or the city-state or the nation. And Plato comes back to this idea, is that it comes back to the manipulative practices that are allowed to flourish in Athenian radicalized democracy that ultimately they result in the death of Socrates. That's what Plato argues anyway. Second, that in democracy, or in the radical Athenian democracy, Plato was like, well, it does not guarantee the vote, the leadership, how leaders are selected, how people are selected for the most powerful positions in Athens is not based on whether they're the best people whether they have the knowledge of how to be good and true leaders to govern and govern well, or the right temperament to be leaders, that they're not overly crazy ambitious, want to be, kings of the world, that the democracy didn't necessarily prevent those people from getting governing positions. That's a problem, according to Plato, that if you want to have a really good society, you cannot let bad people be elected to powerful positions. Pretty straightforward, if you think about it. How can you have a good situation when a good outcome is a good state if your very leadership selection mechanism opens the door for the very worst of your citizens to be in control and making decisions and passing laws over the best? It doesn't ensure they're going to have the knowledge. It doesn't. It's like that sophism's running through here. Whoever can make the most awesome sounding argument for whatever the law is very likely going to woo the more common voter and the person that's not trained in that stuff. But that may not be in that voter's interest at all. And so they very well could elect somebody that's just not fit for the job at all. And in order to get this to help his Athenian, because remember, Plato wrote this, and other Athenians at the time were able to read this, and Plato had this in his schools and stuff, in his school, the academy, is that all his students would have read this. So that has a direct impact on how people are thinking about their type of governance. And it's like he does this analogy, the ship of state. And so to simplify this analogy, I gave you a sort of decoder key that you can swap the bold words for the other, and then you can reread through it. But the idea is this is the way he conceptualized what goes on in radical Athenian democracy, is assume that the city-state or the nation is a ship. It's like a sailing ship. It's a boat. And on that ship, you have a crew and captains. Well, you have the ship owner, the person who owns the ship. Well, in a democracy, that's supposed to be the people, whoever that counts as. And so the people own the ship, but they don't really know much about how to govern the ship. They're not expert navigators by any stretch of the imagination. And if you think about that, that seems true. You let people vote, or people have right to vote in democracy-style governances that don't necessarily know anything. They've never led or even coached a softball team. But yet they have the ability to vote on people who are going to be coaching an entire city-state or nation. And so the people that don't have, a majority of people that don't have the knowledge of how to govern are the ones that are selecting those who will be the governors. Okay, Plato would say, ooh, that's a little tough there. Well, then what do you have also on the ship? You have the ship owner. See, the ship owner is not really in charge of where the ship goes at all in this case, besides they get to vote for who? Well, they vote for the sailors. These are your politicians. These are the people that are on the ship in terms of they're right there in the head of government. And all of them, according to Plato, they're always crowding around the ship owner, the politicians. That's like your political ads, if you want to think about it in today's terms. They're always trying to coax the ship owner to say, hey, put me in charge of the ship. Put me in charge. Make me captain. And then they try to tell you through all kinds of ways, through trying to build you up, and we'll see this, or trying to tear the ship owner down, or the populace, the people, to convince them to say, hey, pick me, pick me, pick me to be the captain of the ship. But Plato would say those sailors, they don't know anything about running the ship either, really. It's like they're sailors. They're not true captains. And so, well, what does that mean? Well, the idea is that the sailors amongst themselves, they will eventually convince the ship owner to give them a turn at the rudder of guiding the ship, governing, leading, ruling the ship of state. The ship is, again, the whole state. And the people supposedly own the ship. That's your demos, your democracy. The people. And then the sailors that are not fit to be the captains convince the ship owner to let them try to be the captains. Okay. And then when they succeed, they pat themselves on the back like, hey, you did a good job. This is someone who knows ships. They congratulate themselves, but what do they really do? Do they really know anything about sailing and navigation? Not necessarily. But what they do know is how to manipulate the ship owner, the people. And remember, this is Plato. All I'm doing is trying to explain his reasoning, the way he thinks about this. And then the worst part, Plato would say, is that so you have actual true captains out there amongst the society, amongst Athens. He would say someone like Socrates was a true captain, trying to get Athens to be better than it was. But then what happens when the true captain comes up? Well, the sailors, the professional class politicians, they don't want a true captain. They don't even believe such can exist most times. They see the world through the eyes of themselves. They look in a mirror and only see themselves reflected back because they don't possess this true knowledge, this true leadership, true governing knowledge. And so they can't believe that somebody else might. It's kind of like the idea, if you can think about it in terms of spiritual religious belief, is that somebody that doesn't believe will look at other people who do and be like, well, I don't know if they really believe or not. I mean, I never have, so how could they? And so that's the mentality, a similar parallel mentality with the professional class, sophist trained sailors and professional class politicians in this radical Athenian democracy, is they're like corrupt to the core, according to Plato. They're just manipulative. They're just they think they can run the ship. They want the ship owner, the people, to put them in charge, be captains. But they're not real true captains. And so, but they live this way. They breathe it. This is their way of life. And, there's no real capital T truth. It's just whatever wins the day in terms of good speaking skills. And so they can't believe that someone else might actually possess all the qualities one actually should possess to be a good true captain or a good true leader or government of a nation. It's like, no, all we are is what we are, and that's all that could ever be, and that's all that is. And Plato thought, well, that was false, that there are true captains. But what happens when they come around is, well, the sailors immediately don't trust them. They're always wondering, what is this person's con? And then they're trying to toss the true captain overboard, smear them, toss them overboard, all that stuff. So, yeah. And so it goes along that, I've talked through essentially what I'm scrolling past. Well, and so that's one of the criticisms of that ship of state, is that radicalized democracy, according to Plato, enables the very worst of a population to become the leaders of that population. It does not stop that. And once they're in control, they prevent any true good captains from most of the times even ever getting in leadership positions. If they identify them, they get them out, or they try to as quick as they can. And so they're controlling things. And he's like, that can't be a good state. That can't be good if that's the way your selection mechanism allows to happen. Well, then third, it tends to go even deeper, that it's like, that it doesn't compel the true or the good leaders to actually run for office. It doesn't compel the good people to be in the right slots. That it just doesn't, because people are free to choose in democracy. This is where Plato criticism this notion of freedom in democracies is that, you're free to choose to be a leader if you're in the people, the group that can vote. That you're free to be president or whatever, a senator or a representative in a modern, more contemporary democracies. You're free. You can choose to participate in political life, but you're also free not to if you don't want to. You're not forced to hold a political office. Well, Plato thinks, no, that if you've got truly good leaders, a good society with good citizenry that has plenty of good sense would compel the best to be in charge of them, whether the best wanted to be or not. That this is freedom that's too free for Plato. That you can't have your best people just saying, no, I don't want to be associated with all this conniving and scheming stuff that seems to be associated with politics. I'll just go over here and live my life and do my own thing. Well, Plato's like, if a society allows that to happen, if they allow people to be free to do that, to pursue their own interest and their own happiness, well, a lot of times the best of a society, their interest and happiness is not built trying to lead the masses and be in government. So the best, the brightest, the most good people tend to go away and lean away and get involved in other things rather than being compelled to actually be good leaders, which they might actually have the knowledge to be. I thought that was a problem. The fourth thing is that with all this in radical Athenian democracy, with all this conniving and scheming and stuff, and this propaganda, what happens is that it brainwashes and trains the voting masses, the people, or in Plato's case, it'd be the common, these more common people that Pericles had allowed, finance to be in the voting positions, that it allows them to be trained to only respect and honor and think that the best leaders are those who do what? Well, it trains the voting populace, the more common that are not able to get this sophist training, that they're brainwashed by the others who are to think that just because someone's speaking well and they're saying, hey, here's this problem and I'm your solution to it, so vote for me. Or here's this thing that you really should want, and then I will give that to you, so vote for me. And so the mentality becomes that, voters in a democracy, or radicalized Athenian democracy, we're being trained like trained dogs, where it's like, they're trained to when the professional class politician says, oh, this is very important, this is something you really should want, you want it, you want it, you want it. The voter ahead of time may have thought, well, I've never even thought about that. I didn't think I need that. But now they're telling you you're supposed to have it. And they're like, well, I guess I'm supposed to have it. And then the politician right behind that saying, well, here, I'll give that to you. Just put me in a position of leadership. You really want this. You do, you do, you do. Whether the voter does or not, they become convinced they do. And then the idea is then the politician, of course, they convince voters of something that the politician maybe can provide. And they convinces voters, hey, you need this, want this. Then convinces voters that the only way you're going to get what you need and you want is to put me in office. And then once the politician is actually put into office, a lot of times they don't deliver at all on what they promised. All of a sudden, that thing that was so important that everybody supposedly wanted and needed, that they didn't know they did before the politician told them, but even once they put the politician in office, well, then they quickly forget they wanted it and needed it because they didn't in the first place. But they got whipped up into a frenzy by the politician. So then the politician doesn't even worry about fulfilling the promise at all. It's like, oh, well, I'm in office now, so what does it matter? Then Plato thought that's how it worked. Or either it can go the other way. It can be things like, like it can be the politician fear mongers. They're like, whoa, here's this big threat. Here's this big threat to our democracy, things like that. And then they're like, they got the voters trained to be, oh, there's a big threat. Ooh, what do we do? What do we do? Then the politician says, well, just elect me. I'll solve that problem for you. And then the voters do. and the sad part is, the way Plato would portray it, is that it's like the trained animal, where it's like, okay, they promise you a treat in the first scenario. They promise you a treat and say, you really want this treat. So, okay, puppy, bark or sit down or shake. And then, okay, the dog's like, well, I want the treat. I'm supposed to want the treat. So it does. And then that gets the professional politician elected. But then once, this is the insidious part, or the really sad part, or the ironic part, is that once the politician gets in office, then they don't ever give the trained dog a treat. And the dog's like, okay, well, I didn't get my treat, but maybe I never wanted it in the first place. That's fine. Then when the next election cycle comes around, they're convinced they need that treat again. And then they run right in there and vote for them again. It's like, for Plato, this is not how you build a good society. You can't let this stuff. You can't let the people be manipulated to this degree, because all that's happening is this professional class of politicians is running everything to their own advantage, and the actual people aren't really controlling. I mean, it violates the very fundamental idea of a democracy to have the people think they have control and a say in what's going on, but then they actually don't. And all the politicians know this, and it's a big con job. That's what Plato thought of it anyway. Well, then, fifth, radical democracies have a tendency to use that they have this equality to both equals and unequals alike. Well, Plato thought there were real differences between people. And this definitely runs contrary to, say, contemporary ideas. And keep in mind, Plato's right 2,500 years ago. That the thing is Plato would say that, yeah, people have real natures. They have real ways that they have certain aptitudes, certain abilities, certain skill sets. And if you allow all voices to be heard in voting, and in this case, remember, all voices was just 20-year-old male Athenian citizens, those who could afford to pay and those who the government would give money to so they could be there to vote. But if you allow even that small group of voices to be heard, Plato would say that you end up with, why would you ever do that? And then I gave an example here that's hopefully helpful. Plato gives similar examples. I mean, there's multiple of these type examples. But the way to get a feel for why having all voices heard, one vote, everybody gets one vote, and all those votes count as one, and those things, well, how could that ever be bad? Well, think about it if your child's really sick, or your parent, or your pet. It doesn't matter. Whatever, just imagine a creature, human, animal that you care the world about, and it gets really sick, and you don't know how to fix it, like most of us, or many of us at least, that aren't in the medical profession. And so you have to depend on other people to help you with this. You don't want your child to get sick and die. You don't want your parents, your beloved animal, pet, puppy, kitty, whatever. And so you take it. Where? Well, you take it to the hospital if it's a human. You take it to where there's supposedly people that know how to do medical stuff. They have true and real medical knowledge. And you take it to them. Why? Because you don't have it. And this is a problem, so you take it to the people who are supposed to have the knowledge to resolve it. Now imagine when you arrive with your child or parent at the hospital, they say, oh yeah, we'll treat them, no worries. But before we do, we need to take a vote. And so, a vote? I came to the doctors, the supposed and nurses, the people with the true medical knowledge here. Why do we need to take a vote? Oh, well, everybody's got to have an equal voice. You see, in the surrounding domain of the hospital, the way we do things at this hospital is that we take a vote from not only the doctors and the nurses, the trained medical staff with the real medical knowledge that are ultimately going to be doing whatever the outcome of the vote is. The idea is that we allow all the other workers in the hospital that have no medical training, we allow the mechanics at this garage, there's a garage across from the hospital, they have a vote. These people walking their dogs and they have their kitties and stuff. Anybody in the hospital parking lot, anybody walking around it, anybody in their apartment buildings in the immediate vicinity, say a mile or 5 miles out, just make a circle around this 5 miles with a hospital at the center point. We have to get all of them to vote on what the treatment plan for your child's going to be, or your parent, or your spouse. All these people must have a say in how we medically try to intervene in this illness with your loved one. Is that a way you'd want to take your child to? Or your sick parent? Do you really want the medical professionals, the ones with the true and real knowledge, which would be a very small group, maybe depending on the size of the hospital, could be 30 doctors, and then you may have, there's always way more nursing staff than doctors. And so maybe you have 100 people in the whole hospital that have any real true knowledge about medicine and treating sick children. But yet we're going to open the voter pool up to say 5,000 people. And so we got 100 people that have true knowledge, and then we're going to have 4,900 others that have no true knowledge, but everybody gets an equal vote. And then whatever the outcome of that is, that's how we're going to decide what medicines to give your child, whatever. Well, what are the odds that the 4,900 that know nothing about medicine may very well, overwhelmingly by a majority, vote for something that's not good at all for your child? They don't even know the medications, but they say, well, I like the way that name sounds. And then you get a group, a faction that comes up that's really good orators trained by the sophist, that they're really persuasive. Oh, yeah, that medicine's got to be the right medicine because it's got the coolest sounding name. This is disaster, according to Plato. And he says that's exactly how democracies work, radical Athenian democracy. That's how it worked, is if you, or democracy in general, if you open up the voter pool and then that's going to be the outcomes decided by a majority of people, normally the people who know nothing about governing are the ones that are the majority. And so they're the ones making all the most important government decisions are the ones who know nothing. It's the same situation as if you have 100 medical staff that know how to do medicine, but you open the voter pool up to 4,900 that know nothing, and then the odds are the 4,900 are going to pick something that the ones with true and real knowledge and say, hey, they try to make their case like, no, you don't want to give that medicine. But their voice is little. They're 100 against 4,900's voices are very loud and easily persuaded. So that's a problem. So that is Plato's argument against equality in terms of, for Plato, all people are not equal when it comes to the knowledge to do certain things, and the people who do not have that knowledge should not have a vote on those things. That would be Plato. That's counter to a lot of contemporary way of thinking about things. The next is that Plato thought that democracies, because all this freedom, they just inherently created uninformed, immature, indecisive, impulsive, gullible, lazy, all around unpredictable and unreliable citizens. Well, that doesn't sound good if you want to build a good society. How could you have a good society if this is the core traits of the populace? Plato's like, that can't be. And he gives an example there of the idleness, the easily swayed. They'll be for a war one day, against it the next, then just bouncing all around, kind of like bees going from one flower to another. Unstable, capricious, a lot like they would say the Greek pantheon was. So in a sense, for Plato, radical Athenian democracy gets you all those worst behaviors that the gods and the goddesses had in the Greek spiritual worldview of just being fickle and random and, I like this today, I don't like this tomorrow. And then how can that lead to a good society? For Plato, you had to have stability. You couldn't have, and you certainly couldn't have your voting population, or either the citizens, even the ones who can't vote, that are just fickle and unreliable. That doesn't work, according to Plato. Finally, citizens, especially younger citizens, get too much freedom in radical Athenian democracy. They're taught to value freedom. Now, this is potentially true for all, even contemporary democracies. Freedom is this primary value. It's like freedom. I got to be free to make my own decisions, make my own choices. Democracy gives me that. Therefore, democracy is good. I'm not being mean or anything. It's just this is how Plato would summarize this stuff. And so he said, yeah, but then they learn to value freedom, which creates this anti-authority mentality, where it's like an anti-tradition mentality, where it's like, whatever I want, I should be free to want, and therefore I should be free to have. And if I've got people, my wiser elders, that may actually have some wisdom, well, they can't be right. That's old. It's new. And I'm free to think that what I want is right and good. So I just throw away all that past tradition. Regardless if I understand what it did, how it held the society together, I just get rid of that. And he thought that this freedom inherent to democracy, radical Athenian democracy, was corrupting the youth in this way. That it's like, this is the real corrupter of the youth, not Socrates, that was trying to talk about we should get away from this want, this capriciousness, this fickleness, being so focused on money and personal aggrandizement and power, and we should be focused more on care for our souls. This is Socrates. And Plato agreed with Socrates. And so Socrates was inherently going to pull the youth more towards this more traditional picture of, humility, don't embody hubris, which is more consistent with the Greek spiritual worldview. But Plato thought in Democracies, it inherently, because it's given so much thought and decision making and action behavior freedom to the youth, that and this is just something that happens in the radical Athenian democracy, is because you put freedom as a super high value and a big selling point to your type of governance. Well, then it's hard to tell the youth when they start thinking that no, you can't be free in this regard right now. We know better than you because we're older. Well, you don't yet know. Well, the youth's like, no, I'm free to think I know more than you, even though I don't, or even if I do. And so that just creates this instability where you'll have these youth, and it won't necessarily even be loyal when it matters that everybody come together. They're too free to come together. Now, Plato offers many more criticisms of radical Athenian democracy, but that's enough for our purposes. And then you may be at this point, well, okay, Plato, you've tossed all this shade, all this problems, all this stuff with radical Athenian democracy. What's your solution? It's one thing to criticize something. Normally, that's easy. And this is something to learn about philosophy, is that in philosophy, it's always known it's easier to tear something down argumentatively than to build something up argumentatively. The builders have a lot harder road than the destroyers. You can destroy with arguments, you can construct with arguments. The constructors, the builders, those trying to make something and make sense of reality, actually try to find truth, not little t truth, but big T truth. And they have to commit and they have to work decades of life to do that. That's hard. But someone can come in 2 seconds and just try to pull all the legs out from under what they've done and try to drop this edifice they've been trying to build consistently. And normally the person doesn't really understand the big thing they've just that's been built. They tear it down, or they think they do, really quickly. So oftentimes you can destroy a building that took 30 years to build rather than the 30 years time it took to build it. You can destroy it, demolish it and just the length of time it takes to set things up, and then it goes and it falls. It's a whole lot quicker normally to tear up than to build up. And so with Plato, he's been tearing up on radical Athenian democracy. So we have to ask, okay, Plato, that's the easy part, is to criticize something, but what is your solution? What's your alternative? Well, Plato has one. We don't have to accept his alternative. Remember, in philosophy, we entertain, we're not necessarily endorsing. Like, I've not endorsed Plato's criticisms of radical Athenian democracy or how they might apply even to contemporary democracies in the Western world. I'm not saying Plato's right about any of this stuff. I'm just trying to describe what he said so that we can hopefully understand it, to go in and think ourselves about it and make up our own minds, with our own reasoning. But the idea is Plato doesn't just tear it apart. He tries to build up. And it's just, there's a lot of different ways you could describe this. This occurs in one of his books, The Republic, but it stretches over multiple different works of Plato. And I would encourage everybody, at least once in life, to at least try to read The Republic. Get some secondary sources. There's many of them, or some that you have a start in this week's voluntary material. The Republic is worth reading. Not because you have to agree with anything in it. Many people probably don't. But to just see how someone might go about trying to build a whole new way of governance is worthwhile. Because Plato takes you through, this is what Plato's known for, is he takes us through like the idea of how the sausage is made. Like, people may like to eat sausage, but they don't really want to know how it's made. Well, Plato takes you through the making of the sausage, which would be a good steak. And and another thing to keep in mind, it's a hypothetical society, the just society, the good state. Those are interchangeable for our purposes. He talks about building the just society, the just city, like in the terms of justice. And the thing is that he says it's hypothetical. He's not saying that this could ever happen in reality. He's just trying to think about what could a person do to correct for all these problems he's raised against radical Athenian democracy. How could you build a society and type of governance and leadership selection procedure that avoids all these problems of radical Athenian democracy? So he's essentially trying to invent an entirely different system of governance than maybe anything that had ever existed at the time. That's a big task. But it's a task that's your thinkers, your builders, your constructors. He's trying to build that 30-year time period. How long does it take to build a building kind of stuff? And so, but it's all hypothetical. So one thing you always have to give Plato in reading something like the Republic or his proposal about a good state is you have to think in terms of this is what if all things would work out in this way? What if it were to happen as Plato describes it? Would that in fact produce this good state, or at least a state, a city-state, a nation? Does it have a better chance of producing one that avoids all the potential flaws and problems Plato laid at the door of Athenian democracy? That if Plato does that, if at the end of reading the Republic you say, well, yeah, maybe this would be better than what the Athenians had, assume Plato's, some of those criticisms are right, which you'd want to check and see if they are. But the idea is if you assume maybe some of his flaws he's pointed out are real flaws, they're real problems for a sort of democratic type of governance, a radical democratic Athenian type, that if those are real problems, would Plato's alternative, supposed solution to those problems, would it actually solve them? Would it prevent, say, the wrong leaders being selected all the time? Would it, in fact, ensure that at least some of the best were most of the time? That's the way you have to think about the Republic, and just try to disconnect yourself from some of the stuff that initially you might be, whoa, why would anybody want that? That looks like tyranny, dictatorship. Well, maybe it is in some ways. But would that solve the problem that he's trying to solve in comparison to Athenian democracy? That's what you always have to think about is, would this solve the problems that Plato's trying to solve? And if you say yes to that, it probably would, well, then Plato's argumentation has been successful. His alternative would be a legit alternative. Now, and he's the first to say, maybe nobody would want to actually ever build this. But all he's committed to is that if things were to be done in a certain way, it looks like we could avoid some of the worst problems of this sort of radicalized democracy. So, first thing that Plato's got to do in the Republic or to secure a good state, the alternative form of governance, because he comes back to this over and over and over again, one of the core problems of Athenian radical democracy, or radical Athenian democracy, whatever you want to say, or Pericles-based democracy-style governance, you could say it like that too. But Plato considered it to be very radical. But the thing is the first thing to understand is that Plato just wants the best, most knowledgeable, the people with true knowledge about governing well. They need to be the leaders in a good state. That's Plato's core assumption and core claim that he tries to defend over and over and again throughout the Republic, is that you've got to, that good leadership and good governance, governing well, involves knowing how to do that. That you can't have someone that doesn't have the right knowledge of how to govern well turn out to govern well. They could, but you have certainly not ensured it in any stretch of the imagination. You're just roll of the dice at that point. It's like, well, this person just happened to have what we needed. We voted them in. Oh, good. Hey, we got lucky. That's luck. That's not. And you want your good society managed on luck of the draw? Plato's like, no, I mean, in a hypothetical situation, ideally, remember, this is in the ideal, maybe not in the real, but ideally, you'd want the people that know how to do the job well, doing the job well. I mean, that's how you get a well-governed society, is to have people who know how to govern well actually doing the governing. That's the way the reasoning works. And so Plato has to secure out of the gate, and this is the thing to know about the good state or the just society or the republic is another word for it, Plato's notion of republic, that the key to it all is what's going on with the guardians, because they're the rulers ultimately of this society. And so what are the guardians? Who are they? Well, what are they supposed to have? They're supposed to have knowledge, not just of how to govern well. And remember, this is an idealized, superhuman scenario. You'd have people that it's supposed that you did in fact have people that just knew everything. Why not? We're in a hypothetical scenario. Suppose that you had the most super of geniuses, that you could draw from and pull from and put in your leadership positions. I mean, the people that know everything about everything, almost like as close to like God tier knowledge as it's possible for humans to ever have. But more so than even the average human. Like Plato wouldn't put himself in this category. But he says, imagine if you had people that truly knew about governing well, they know about morality, they know about the physical world, they know about engineering, they know about everything, to so far outstripping anybody else that they know the very patterns of the cosmos. They know what's always going to work to achieve a just or a good end. They know this. So that's exactly who you'd want to run the good society, right? If you had people like this, they're your obvious leaders, according to Plato. Who else would be? Somebody that doesn't know these things? I mean, it's like, how could anybody that's not people like that be the better leaders if you want a just society, the most stable society, the society that's going to always come out the best and be the most good? If you got the people that know all there is to know about goodness running the show, how could it not be good? That's Plato's idea anyway. Well, and I'm not going to go through all these pieces, but the key to understand about all this, just to keep this video in a shorter time span, is you want to read through this very carefully with these guardians. And the guardians are the ones that have the true knowledge, and that's knowledge like superhuman God tier knowledge. Plato's not saying that anybody like that actually exists in the world. But what it amounts to is, if you can imagine who the best qualified, best leaders would be, then what you could do in the real world is you say, well, that's who we should be pushing into the leadership positions. Because the idea with it is these people are identified through a testing procedure that all citizens in the good state are tested from childhood all the way into adulthood. And then they're categorized. Their true natures are identified. And that may be kind of strange to people to think today about, but some people have this true nature of being able to obtain this God tier level knowledge of all things, what's good, what's bad, what's right, what's wrong, how to govern, how to do economics, how to do politics, how to do military, how to do social, how to do cultural, how to do philosophical. And in fact, that he would call them philosopher kings. But don't let that deter you. These are not like the everyday average philosophy people. These people are, I mean, you'd think, well, Plato's a philosophy person, and he, of course, philosopher kings. That's pretty self-serving there, Plato. But it's a mistake to think of it that way, because the guardian class that he describes, class in society, group within society, these people are not like, they have skill sets in a deep patriotism and a knowledge, access to the forms, the very cosmic patterns of the universe that your average human, there may be one or two amongst us. Plato would say there is. He thought that such was attainable, but for the very, very small few people. And then so instead of voting for these people, there's testing that goes across the whole populace of citizens. They're identified through this testing. Well, how would they be identified? Well, once you have a guardian or two, they're able to create the best test to identify. They can identify people with guardian natures or the other natures. There's auxiliary natures and there's producer natures. There's three. There's a tripartite thing. Then a person could quibble with that and say, why not 5 or 6 classes of people? That's fine. You can do that. But Plato says that's not going to bother Plato. What matters is that guardian group, though, is that's the people with the true knowledge, God tier level knowledge about how to do everything right. And if you have people like that, would you want them running your society if you want to have a really good running right society? Plato would say, obviously you do. That's debatable, but that's what his claim is. And he gives you reasons for it. I mean, he describes this stuff. And so then you have your guardians. And now what's going to happen, though, is that the person to be, once you get your guardians set up, you could be like, okay, that's all great in the ideal. But realistically, what if things don't work out quite as smoothly and harmoniously like Plato talks about? Well, Plato acknowledges that. And you'd have to read the Republic to see how much he acknowledges it. And then, well, the guardians may have to implement some policies. And this is where people, a lot of times that read the Republic for the first time, they're like, ew. Especially in the modern world, you're like, oh, you don't want to live like this at all. Maybe that's true. I'm not passing yay or nay on it. But the key to it is that, for example, the guardians will have to create a noble lie that manipulates the people. So truth and honesty, not necessarily the only trait of the guardians, it seems. Also, there's going to be arranged marriages. It seems like it's a lottery, but it's really not. Then there's children are removed from their families. Why? So that no one knows who their parents are, no one knows who their children is. And the thought behind it is that then everybody would consider everybody else to be their family. Is that plausible? Implausible? I don't know. But those are some of the proposals that people, and moreover, you have no individual rights. You have no entitlements. You have none of that stuff in the supposed good state. This hypothetical, most just, most good society ruled by the guardian class of people. But read through this description. There's much more to it. I just provided a kind of top layer sort of summary of some of the ideas so you get a feel for it. I'm not trying to say that this is all there is to the good state. It's not. I can already tell you, I've read the Republic many, many times. There's a lot more going on in here. I've taught just the Republic whole semesters. There's a lot more going on in the supposed good state, and there's a tremendous amount more going on with those guardians. It all rests on those guardians, though. If you want to think, is this plausible at all? You know, it all comes down to what does it mean to know what Plato claims the guardians know? In order to understand that, you have to know some of Plato. You have to know Plato's metaphysical and epistemological theories, which, like I said at the beginning of this, it just time ran out, so I'm not able to put all that in there. But if you really want to understand what Plato's getting at with these guardians, you need more knowledge about this, his theory of the forms, how knowledge works, what it is, how we acquire it. It's unfortunate. Time did not allow me to write this out right now. But the way to think about it is just know that Plato has a lot more to say about those guardians. And in that voluntary section in this week's module, you can read more about it. Next time around, by the next semester, that'll be filled out. So where are we going to kind of wrap this thing up with this video is this quest for truth. The idea is there's Plato's allegory of the cave. And so just as a rough and ready, what does one take away from the cave? Plato uses this allegory or myth or story or analogy, whatever you want to refer to it as. It's a scenario he describes, and then he comes back across this like we saw with the ship of state, where you can swap out like certain of these key words and put in other things in those slots. And what you'll see is like he would say this is a good picture of how we move from a state of ignorance to a more knowledgeable or enlightened state. That's one way you can interpret the allegory of the cave. You start out in ignorance, staring at shadows on the wall, what's not real. And then in the end, you end up with knowledge and access and able to truly see what's true and real. So that's one way. It's the progression of a prisoner locked in a cave that's in a domain of ignorance to a person standing on their own 2 feet in the great big wide open world with access to so much more that they never knew existed when they were still a prisoner in the cave. That is the idea. It's always got this feel to it of you start in a state of a sort of mental ignorance or a blind spot in your mind where you think you understand something, but you really don't. And then through this process of education, you come to understand not only that you didn't know what you thought you know, but now you know things that you didn't even fathom before. And that stuff that you know may be more true and real than, and invariably with Plato, when you come to learn and mentally grow, you escape various mental caves. Or like if people have seen the Matrix series of movies, you escape prisons of your own mind. And then you can use that. It's used in psychology. It's used in counseling. I mean, the whole idea is you can become a prisoner in your own mind to certain ways of thinking about stuff, making certain assumptions. Like the prisoners in the cave assume that the shadows on the wall, the shadow puppet show, they have no choice but to watch every day. They assume that's real. That's reality for them. And then, but when one prisoner escapes, for whatever reason, the chains are broken, maybe through education, through whatever, then the prisoner starts seeing that this shadow stuff is a con job, and then goes out of the mouth of the cave and then sees the whole wide world that's nothing like what was on the screen of the puppet show. And it's like having what's sometimes called these aha moments, these moments of realization that what I thought before was not the way of reality. It was not real truth with a capital T. It was just little t truths. It was these sort of, oh yeah, you can assume that's the case, but that's not really the case. The truth is very far different from what I started with. And so that's what the sort of myth of the cave, the allegory of the cave, it doesn't matter how it's referred to, just the cave is fine, Plato's cave. And what he does is, so for our purposes, what would Plato think? Is he thought that your Athenians were trapped in a cave in regards to what Athenian radical democracy actually was. The Athenians thought they had a good society, but they really didn't, according to Plato, according to Socrates too. They thought it was great. We have all this freedom. We have all this abilities. Look at what we do. We're not like the god kings over here. We're not like the oligarchs or the tyrannies. Our people are free. A very small group of them. But we are free. And then Plato's like, but no, you're really not. And if you think you're good, you're actually not. That what you have is you've been very highly manipulated to think that you're free, that you're making your own decisions, you're picking your own leaders, you're in control of the laws that are passed, but you're really not. And so that's what Plato was trying to free them from, the cave of Athenian radical democracy thinking, and to try to show them an alternative, which was the good state and his ideas that are in the Republic. His criticisms of Athenian democracy show up in the Republic, as well as his solution. That's why I say it's worth reading this whole book. It will take time. It takes patience. It takes a lot of secondary material, but it's worth doing. And so the whole point of it is to try to free the minds of those who would be reading it at the time, the Athenians at the time, to let them see that what they thought was good governance was actually not. It was shadow puppetry on the wall, and that what may be an alternatives of governance may be actually true and good and better and get better outcomes than your radical Athenian democracy. So we will get to talk about these ideas during this week's discussion. But either way, I hope this video has been helpful. Plato is always interesting. He has had a tremendous impact on the history of philosophy, not just in this sort of, what we've done, what you've seen is in philosophy is called social political philosophy. This is a domain within philosophy where philosophy people talk about stuff like this. They talk about democracy and oligarchy and tyrannies. There's a whole subfield in philosophy that's dedicated to doing just this, what we've been doing in this video, talking about this stuff. But there's also domains in philosophy that's more metaphysics, epistemology. The interesting thing about Plato is he did all of these domains. He did metaphysics. He did epistemology, like what is the nature of reality? What does it mean to know? Also, what does it mean to do good governance? What does a good society look like? What are laws? Are they just? Are they unjust? That's social political philosophy. That's what we've been looking at. We got a view this week of Plato's style social political philosophy. And in the next semester, there'll be even these views of these here too, but also ethics and aesthetics, like beauty and things like that. Plato talks about all this. This is why sometimes Plato has said that a lot of Western philosophy, everything that came after Plato, is a lot of footnotes to Plato. People trying to just fathom and build out philosophy. I mean, Socrates got the ball rolling. Plato built the first university of philosophy. I mean, so it would be like any university. There's particular classes that focus on particular domains in philosophy, and so Western philosophy, owes many questions, ways of thinking, and not saying that Western philosophy agrees with Plato's criticisms of Athenian democracy or even any contemporary forms. That's not what I'm saying. I mean, that many people in contemporary Western philosophy may very harshly disagree with these criticisms Plato's launched, even against Athens democracy. And there's people that have written whole books about that, saying, is Plato right about these things or is he wrong? So it's not what Plato particularly said on particular issues where his contribution is. Plato's contribution to the history of philosophy is that he put all of this stuff in organized classes and essentially developed the branching system in philosophy so that you have whole domains that people do social political, people do metaphysics, people do epistemology, people do logic computation, and they can specialize in all these fields. But Plato built a whole system using all of them. And it shows how they can all interlink and work together to create these massive theories like of reality and knowledge. And then how that leads to good governance, or how it could, or how it isn't going to, all that stuff. But either way, I hope that, I've motivated people to see that Plato's very interesting. He had a very significant contribution to philosophy. And so it's always worth thinking about his stuff, talking about his stuff. We will do that this week more. Until then.